I'm Andy Jenkins with Crosswinds Foundation for Faith and Culture, and welcome to the Warrior Hope podcast. This is season number 4, and we have been taking on this concept of disentangled. I'm going to shoot straight with you. When we began this season 4, I was really envisioning it as a tiny mini-series to buy myself some time while I continued editing and putting together some of the incredible interviews that I accumulated from interviewing several warriors and veteran family members over the past season, from really summer 2023 when we started releasing and screening our film Trauma Comes Home, grabbing these stories to really illustrate how people got entangled into the military, rightly so, because the scripture that we've looked at, 2 Timothy 3, talks about no soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life. He entangles himself into the military to serve the one who enlisted him, but then you've got to re-entangle back into everyday life and disentangle from the military. So it's just this, you move from one chapter, you close it, next chapter, close it, next chapter, all this disentangle from home, entangle into the military, disentangle from military, re-entangle into home life. We talk about all of that in this book from the standpoint of Scripture. This is a 6-lesson Bible study, Disentangled: Warriors, Hope, and Faith, that Bob Waldrop, the founder and president of Crosswinds, and I put together during the last year and a half. I thought, as I'm putting together and editing all this incredible footage, it was so much, it was taking me so much longer. So I thought, well, let me buy myself some time. I'll craft together this little mini series so that I can do those families and those veterans' stories justice, and not just kind of rush through just to get it done. But this thing is going on now. I mean, I think in episode number 8. Today marks a move, though, where we're going to not just talk about who a warrior is, not just talk about some of the costs warriors pay, but we're going to start stepping towards hope and healing. Now, part of stepping towards hope and healing, it means this. You've got to be honest and tell yourself the most honest version of the story about you that you can. And sometimes that means that in the past there were pain points. Sometimes in the past there were good points, and the good doesn't negate the bad doesn't negate the good. We tend to, in our culture, think things are all bad or things are all good. Most stuff is a mix of both. And so as we step forward in hope and healing, I want you to pay attention to that. The screen share that you're about to see, or the recording that you're about to hear, depending on where you're accessing this episode, it's going to come from chapter 5, first part of the chapter of Disentangled. And again, you can access this book down in the show notes below. You can access the screen share, the complete course down below. At some point, we'll have a live recording of this and then make that available to you as well. And then after we walk through the content, I'm going to share a story from a Songs of Hope event. This is Bernie, the songwriter, and Joe Montalbano, a veteran, and they're writing a story about a song about Joe's story. And Joe was very adamant. I remember we were recording this footage, kind of walking around the grounds there with our iPhones to capture the content so we could share it at Workplay, downtown Birmingham, before Bernie played the song on stage for the first time. And I remember Joe was adamant about, I don't want this to be just a downtrodden, like typical old school country song about woe is me. The military, he said, was difficult, and there were some incredible moments, and neither negates the other. And so pay attention to that as you go through this content from lesson 5, and then also pay attention to that as you hear his story. Now, you might remember this verse right here. It is included in your book on page 115, at the bottom of page 115. We've got 2 verses as we lead into chapter 5 about hope and healing. As we go into chapter 5, we are entering into the final section of the book. So this book, Disentangled, has 3 sections: warriors, hope, and faith. we talked through in the section of warriors, part number 1, we dialogued about who a warrior is, and second of all, the cost warriors pay. And then as we moved into hope, we really got into finding hope for PTSD, finding hope for moral injury. That was lessons 3 and 4. Now we're going to dialogue about faith. So we're going to pull hope and healing together and then move forward in the final lesson about your next mission. So here we are about hope and healing. Lesson number 5 is this one with this verse. He heals the brokenhearted and he binds up their wounds. Psalms 147:3. Again, that's one of the verses that we highlighted at the end of the previous lesson, lesson 4. As we move forward to hope and healing, that is the promise that we want to cling to, is that as we move forward, we know that healing is available, and we understand that healing happens, and healing is what God desires for me. It's what God desires for you as we continue stepping forward. Just to maybe state it clearly here, what we're driving at is we don't want to merely understand the cost warriors pay for service as it relates to specifically PTSD and moral injury. In order to move forward, we want to walk intentionally in this hope and healing. So that's going to be really the goal as we step forward. Let me bring you up to a quote. This was on page 117 in your book. Lieutenant Colonel Don Mallon is featured in our film Invisible Scars. He says this. He was a chaplain about warriors. He had served multiple deployments, helped soldiers during war and on the home front. So both in battle and making that transition back home. He says, here's the problem with many times when warriors come home. They're not home emotionally. They're not home spiritually. They're not home psychologically. They're still fighting the war back over there. And in order to be effective citizens, in order to be effective in their life, they need to come back home on the inside. You know, think about that. And, you know, whether or not you agree with him, and reasons why that transition might be difficult. Now, in the book, we do highlight on page 118 that there are 2 factors that might hinder getting treatment for PTSD, might hinder treatment for moral injury and coming back home. The first one is this: as a warrior, you are trained to push through pain and to finish the mission. One warrior that we interviewed, he said, you can't just stop in the middle of a battle and say to the enemy, hey, hold on, like I'm injured. You got to push forward. You're even trained as a warrior, you get injured and it's not battle. Man, you got to get this done because people somewhere are depending upon you doing your part. Here's another factor, and we really have endeavored to remove the stigma here on this. So many people think that emotional or mental trauma is a sign of weakness. And really, it's not. In our book, Warrior Hope, I want to read you a passage from that on page 50. We really asked this: what might happen if we took emotional healing seriously? If we took our emotional capacity as seriously as we took our financial capacity? If we paused and took the necessary time to deal with the emotional traumas that we do for physical wounds? What if we encouraged emotional exploration and growth like we foster intellectual endeavors? What if we explored what's happening inside of us before we tried to offload on other people? What if we treated emotional hurts with the same care as the spiritual or big questions of life? Question for you, page 118, and there's space in the manual for you to write your answers to this.
And just think through it. Are you still carrying past pains? Maybe in that sense, just kind of answer, are you still carrying unresolved stuff on the inside that you might factor as moral injury? And another layer to that question, and just press pause on the video here if you need to. Do sight, sounds, and smells trigger emotional responses from you? In other words, that might be related to PTSD. What we want to do in this chapter is outline 5 steps, 5 keys to moving forward for PTSD and moral injury. And I'll just highlight on here. Here they are. We're going to walk through each of these. Some of these are, it's going to be review, a little bit of review, because we've hit some of this as we move through some of the past lessons. In lesson 3, we talked about PTSD and ways to move forward from that. And lesson 4, we talked a bit about moral injury and ways to move forward from that. This list here, by the way, is in the middle of page 119 in your book. I do want to highlight here on the screen that forgiveness issue on number 5 relates only to moral injury. But these are our 5 keys. Number 1 is we're going to acknowledge it. We're going to admit there's a problem. Number 2, we're going to decompress. We're going to share that with others. Number 3, don't do it alone. We're going to get help if we need it. Number 4, we're going to be on mission. That is, find something to do that's productive and purposeful. We're going to talk about that in this chapter, but the entire final chapter of this book is all about number 4. And then 5, forgiveness is going to relate only to moral injury. So, number 1 is on page 119, we start dialoguing about acknowledging the problem. This graphic comes from page 120. You have to admit there is an issue. Nobody can get help for you. Pushing it off like David did and trying to cover it up like David did, regardless of what the issue it is, it only makes the problem bigger. And you just got to think, no matter how successful we are at hiding our hurts, there will always be someone who can see our pain. They might not know the details of it, but what I would encourage you to do is don't shut those people out. And that leads to point number 2 is to decompress. This is on page 121 is when we start talking about this. The graphics on page 122. Share that problem with others. Now, for sure, as we say in the middle here, you want to protect your family from things that they can't unsee and unhear. There are valid reasons why you don't want to share everything with your family. The reality is your family wants to connect with you as bad as you want to connect with them. As uncomfortable it is for you to share your story with them, you need to find a way, with certain details maybe not in there. It might not be easy to figure out how to do that, but fighting the war that you fought is not easy either. If you don't feel like you can open up and share your story, share a resource to your family that allows them to hear the stories of other warriors. The documentaries that we have, Invisible Scars, Honoring the Code, again, there are links inside this module where you can see those. They can help your family get an idea, or you could attend counseling together. You could give them the Warrior Family book or free audio book. A trained counselor can help you share your story in a way that your family can understand your trauma. And this is key, without exposing them to the things from which you want to shield them that you think that they could not handle. The reality is, family members can handle far more than what you think and will accept you far more than what you might imagine. And you are also absolutely right. There are some things they don't need to hear. If you're involved in therapy, then consider maybe taking them with you. Uh, and as you do that, point number 3 on the screen is find someone who can hear it all. Now we ask the question on the bottom of page 121, who's a person you would most trust to share a secret hurt? what would you say to them? In other words, what I want you to do is I want you to write down right there the thing, even if you need to do it in code, because somebody might see your book. I don't think they will. But what's the thing you need to offload and just release and just maybe put a pin in it after you write it, that we're probably going to address a little bit more of that when we get to point number 5. Now, there's a great story in the Bible that refers to this. In the book of Numbers 31, in Israel, they went and they took over Midian. And when they defeated the Midianites, they absolutely killed everybody. When they returned, Moses instructed the warriors to stay outside the camp for 7 days. He just says this from Numbers 31. You can read the entire story in Numbers 31. However, it may just highlight some of these passages to you. And you, Moses, the spiritual leader, talking to the warriors, camp outside the camp, meaning the camp where everybody was following the Ark of the Covenant and they all lived around the tabernacle. Stay outside the camp 7 days. Whoever has killed any person and whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves, and you shall wash your clothes on the 7th day and be clean, and afterwards you may enter the camp. Now, this right here is interesting because this was not required by Old Testament law, yet Moses, the leader, he demands that they pause. Now, Numbers 19:11, we do find what is found in the law. The law says, Numbers 19:11, this was a religious observance. Everybody in Israel would have followed. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean for 7 days. Now, you and I, right now, we don't touch a dead body that often unless we are a nurse, a doctor, a mortician, perhaps a first responder. In that day and age, everybody was born in the house, died in the house. You would take care of your loved ones as they passed and then bury them. This was not outsourced to professionals. So this would be very common. And what many religious leaders think now, Bible commentators, theologians, is that this 7-day thing was not so much because you're tainted. It was more of God demanding, hey, you've just been through a difficult emotional thing. Take a pause. Don't just go back to work or school or farming or chores the next day. Take a week off and don't even go to the tabernacle. Don't go offer sacrifice. Rest for 7 days. It provides an opportunity for people to pause. Now, notice Moses added this and said that the warrior should do this. Here's what we think is, even though it seems like a strange command to you and I, for the warriors, it created a buffer from everyday life, and it provided an opportunity for the warriors to pause and mourn before being reunited with their families and the people and being thrust into everyday life. It was like in days of War War I and World War II, when many soldiers would come back from war and it take months because they're traveling on ships. And on the ships, they're in the bunks and they're on deck and they're playing cards and they're talking and processing what happened. And they're not like some of my friends who have been deployed and then injured and then less than 24 hours later are back in full-blown society, almost like whiplash, with no one who could understand what they've been through. You see, to be clear, in the Old Testament, the law said nothing about staying outside the camp. What I think Moses is getting at is these warriors had just experienced a traumatic event. War is not clean, no matter how necessary. Remember, we read the quotes by uh, General Sherman. We read from Wilfred Owen. We read from Douglas MacArthur and Nehemiah. War has changed in terms of weaponry and strategy, but it's always been violent and gory and traumatic. The warriors had just experienced a traumatic event. Again, they needed a moment to disentangle from military duty so they might re-entangle into civilian life. So Moses effectively gave these soldiers time to decompress, just like, you might imagine soldiers doing years ago on a ship, and everything that was happening on board. On page 123, we talked through some subpoints of decompressing. Page 123. Here's what we think happened. That pause, and the reason Moses did it, and of course, kind of a byproduct of being on a ship, coming back home instead of just flying right back over on a jet. Moses stopped the warriors outside of the camp. Most likely, they could see their homes from where Moses had them camped. However, before taking those last few steps with their loved ones, they needed time to mourn together. Now, think about, did you have time to mourn the loss of fellow warriors, the things you saw, the things you participated in? Was there a plan in place for you to do this? Observation B, also on page 123, that pause, it created a moment when the spiritual leader of the group said audibly, out loud, not just nobody had to think or guess. It was clear. You are accepted. You are okay. You are still one of us. Moses welcomed his warriors home, which let them know the separation in that moment was not an indication that they had done wrong or were not accepted. He was letting them heal. You think about, in our culture, many veterans have returned to the U.S. as heroes. World War I, World War II. I mean, fanfare, ticker tape parades, famous pictures in Time and Life magazine. But that was not always the case. Many Vietnam veterans, even men who were drafted and had no choice but to go, returned home to scorn and opposition. Even in one of our films, Trauma Comes Home, we have one man being interviewed that was the only living passenger on a plane coming back from his deployment to Vietnam, and then was strip searched when he got home at customs. You see, how different would it be if someone reached out and said, "Hey, you're one of us," even if they didn't have necessarily an eloquent phrase or the right words, or it it was just a connection, human to human. Point C at the bottom of page 123, the families were being protected by this pause. Families suffer when warriors suffer, and when warriors are still processing. So imagine what would have happened if the warrior returned home immediately after a war and went back to their families. It probably wouldn't have been healthier for either the warrior or his wife or his children had the warrior immediately returned and not had time to buffer, to come down, to process. You think back to our verse, no soldier in active service entangles themselves in the affairs of everyday life. You've got to remember that warriors disentangle from everyday life in order to serve. So in your case, that took time, weeks of boot camp. Before weeks of boot camp, probably weeks or even months of waiting for the day that you go to boot camp. And then after boot camp, additional specific training. In a real sense, that process must be reversed in order to come back home. Now, inactive soldiers, to maybe restate what Paul says in the opposite way, don't entangle themselves in active service. They entangle themselves in the affairs of everyday life. So you had to disentangle from everyday life to entangle in service. Now you need to disentangle from service to re-entangle into everyday life. And just a question, maybe to make a note in the margin of your book. Which entanglement was easier to do? Was it easier to disentangle from home and entangle in service, or to disentangle from service and entangle into home? The last week I was at the VA meeting and touring with several of the leaders there, and they said one of the things that we've acknowledged is we almost need like a reverse boot camp to like get back into the process of civilian life. The observation is this: in the same way you entangled in military life, now it's time to untangle and entangle into something new. Point D, page 124, returning to the camp together at the same time, it created a marker for everyone. Now, all throughout the Bible, you see this idea that monuments and markers are essential. There's, for instance, this idea in Joshua chapter 4, when the children of Israel cross into the promised land. Joshua leads them, and Moses took them through the Red Sea to come from Egypt to the wilderness. Now Joshua's taking them out of the wilderness to the promised land, and they crossed through the Jordan River to do that. And he instructed them, one man from each tribe grab a huge stone from the middle of the Jordan River. And when we get over to the other side, we're going to make this monument of 12 big stones. Here's why. Because in the future, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, "What are these stones? What are these big rocks?" Then you shall inform your children, saying, "Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God," now the Jordan is a flowing river, right? "For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever." So markers matter. The stones Joshua laid were not only markers for the people who set them, they were a marker for everyone of God's faithfulness. And so they could be remembered, and others could be reminded of this in the future. When Moses told them to return to the camp together, it provided a moment for all of them in the future to remember we came back together. It was a moment in time. Sometimes you might have scars that are markers. Sometimes you might have other markers that show progress. And in the book right here, want to highlight this question because maybe in some sense you need to reframe your scars and see them as markers of progress. Scars, wounds and scars are very different. A wound is an open sore that needs healing. A scar is different. It shows evidence that healing has happened, and it is a marker of forward movement. So if you did not get this returning to camp together with everyone, still there might be some markers that you have that can remind you, hey, there might be some distance you still want to go. There might be some distance, a gap between where you are and where you want to be, but don't forget about the gain of how much distance you've already come. Observation E about decompressing together, it's on page 125. There's nothing you can do or have done that's so bad that God will not accept you any longer. So I want to remind you of the truth that we learned in the previous chapter about David, about forgiveness. 3 points. He admitted he was struggling. He admitted he could not save himself. He asked for help. God is always standing ready, willing to accept, to cleanse, so that we can move forward. God does. God will forgive anything, but you must receive that forgiveness in order to experience it. It's almost like 2,000 years ago from the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished. The payment for all sin is made. Father, forgive them." But in order to experience it, it has to be reached out, and I accept it. I take it. Now, I want to remind you, all 5 of these subpoints, A, B, C, D, and E, are all dealing with decompressing. So we had 5 points we want to review, 5 keys to healing. We've talked about acknowledging, we've talked about decompressing, and those 5 points there were all 5 subpoints, A, B, C, D, and E, about this right here, decompressing.
At some point in time, you have to cut it off and say it's time to be positive. It's time to, go forth and conquer, and forget the bad times,
Yeah, I just like the idea of just trying to paint that picture, because 99% of all the songs and movies that are talked about combat and combat vets, are about the lows and the combat.
I don't feel like anybody in the world needs to hear the same old country stuff that is about the bad times. Let's remember the good times.
Yep.
Fighting for the red, white, and blue. So what we're trying to come up with is the idea of normal life in a non-normal world. So what I want to do is paint a picture both of how it's a crazy world in a combat world, but it's still normal everyday life, and you have to do everyday things and stuff. And then adding to that the fact that he dropped out of high school to go over to where he went at the height of the surge and all that stuff. It's really an interesting story, so I really want to get into that a lot.